Van started IDASA partly because he felt there was a gap between the struggle and the system. And he felt that we needed to bridge the gap between the struggle and the system. And IDASA was part of a civic initiative to try and bridge that gap. But it was also part of a political initiative, eventually, to try and foster not only dialogue, but also negotiations and talks between groups that were very far apart at the time. So the first days were very exciting, very interesting. Of course, there were also lots of problems. I think, for example, of the murder of Eric Ntonga, one of the colleagues, early colleagues from PE. You know, full of challenges. I think, for example, when we started the Pretoria office, it was a mixture of an act of stupidity and bravery, because we felt that we had to take IDASA into the heart of Afrikanerdom. Because if you want to have a dialogue, one of the problems was that you had lots of discussions between people who actually agreed with each other. You know, sort of lefties and black South Africans, all who were feeling that apartheid was wrong and that something needed to be done about it. But the missing element in all of this were the Afrikaners, who were the supporters of apartheid. And so we felt, let's go there into this territory and let's start challenging them on their beliefs. So the first days was, I mean, if you think back about it, it was quite amazing. The only place where we could have meetings was in St. Albans Cathedral, because the rest of Pretoria would not allow IDASA near anything. You know, we had started an office in Randjiesfontein, and Randjiesfontein is in Midrand. And the reason why we started the office first in Randjiesfontein was IDASA was running up to be banned, which it eventually was. Its funding was heavily curtailed and so on. So we thought one of the strategies was, if you buy properties, then once we banned, we could start selling the properties every year to generate money. So we bought this property in Midrand, and the sort of idea of the Pretoria office and the Joburg office were brought together there. And then after a year or so, we felt, let's start the proper office in Pretoria and take it to the Afrikaners. And that's the story I was telling you. So we had very interesting projects. Of course, we had lots of black participants, lots. I mean, the hall was always packed with black Africans. And then we had about 10 whites. And over the years, of course, our aim was we wanted some balance, because the actual target was the white community, and particularly the Afrikaans community. So I want to link three levels in IDASA. The one is the level of loose coordination with the ANC, which was underground because the ANC was banned, and which involved eventually, in my particular case as the then head of IDASA in Pretoria, and setting up that office, doing underground work in the ANC, particularly related to death squads, and how we started to reveal the death squads, but also political work amongst Afrikaners. Then there was a more sort of public aspect of IDASA, which is what I call the civic aspect of IDASA, which was really a people-to-people initiative. And then there was the more political aspect, which was really at the top. How do you deal with political leadership and different political leaderships? So these three levels were always synchronized in IDASA. The underground one was really not very often spoke about, but you know, in our private conversations, Van and with Alex and others, these were the things that we had coordinated, synchronized and discussed. So to go back to Pretoria, those three aims were obviously also carried into the Pretoria office. And that's why we started off at St. Albans, but very quickly tried to find a venue that was more acceptable for mainstream Afrikaners to come to. And we chose our speakers very carefully so that we could reach out to those Afrikaners. Because the positioning of IDASA was very important, you needed to have some kind of, let's say, credibility in the Afrikaans community and in the, generally speaking, in the white, conservative white community. So we had to tread a very careful line, lest we be seen to be too close publicly, to be close to the ANC. Because remember, at that time, nobody wanted to talk, well, very few people wanted to talk to the ANC, let alone join the ANC, but there was no talk to the ANC, it was the official government policy. So I'll give you examples of safe spaces. I think the younger crowd, myself, Janet, Nick Bourain, you know, there was a whole host of us who were all activists and who entered into IDASA precisely to help build this connection between, this bridge between ANC, the people, IDASA, the ANC, etc. A whole complex web. To give you another example, you know, I, as part of the underground work, had gotten hold of the, well, we started with Vlakplaas. And so we, you know, I did the first interviews with Dirk Coetzee, and that was my project in the ANC. So when the Dirk Coetzee thing came up, I first, Umbay and myself had long discussions about it. I asked Umbay, said, why don't you go to Lusaka and just talk to so-and-so, and then see what we do with this possibility. And I went to Lusaka afterwards, and we decided, the ANC decided basically that this project was very important, needed to go ahead. And that's how we started to smuggle all these Vlakplaas people out. And of course Jacques and Max, they were involved in the start. Then eventually wrote the story and broke the story publicly. But there were many other people like that, and there were people before that. Part of my job was to get proof and evidence, and of course we were interested in the network, and also to catch the Askaris basically. And I got hold of some of the guns that they used to assassinate people. And I had to get them out to Lusaka. So one of the interesting things, if you talk about safe spaces, is Van at that time, Van Zyl at that time, lived in the Entwerfen's house in Joburg, Dick Entwerfen's house, and I got hold of this plastic gun that was an assassination pistol that you could walk through X-ray machines, and its mechanisms were disguised in all kinds of other ways, but the rest was made out of bakelite, and you know, you couldn't pick it up in those days in the X-rays. And an AK-47, which we thought were involved in the assassination of some activists and so on. Anyway, so I got all these guns and so on, and I needed a safe space to store them. And I decided, well, I'm going to store it in the Entwerfen's house because nobody would look there. So I took it there, and I said to Van, you know, sitting in this nice house, and I said, look, I've got this thing here which I will show you, but you've got to promise you don't say a word and don't ask any questions. So I opened up the thing, and there was this AK-47 and this, and Van says, I said, this has got to stay here. So he disguised it as fishing tackle. And he told Jane all the time, he said, no, leave that kist there, this is old Varkas there. This is Andre's stuff, it's fishing tackle. And, but it's actually guns, and we smuggled it out. So I think this was high risk stuff, of course, because if those things came out, you know, the government was saying this is an ANC front, which I don't think it was, but we were obviously ANC people in IDASA. But there were definitely safe spaces, and IDASA needs a lot of credit for doing those kinds of things. I think IDASA was behaving intelligently in the sense that it was quite a critical organization, and Van's intellect was central to that criticality, that ability to think intellectually and to analyze the world around you. But I must say, remember, we came from the ECC and all those traditions. So in South Africa at that time, young people had an extraordinary ability to conduct meetings clandestinely in secret and to do really astonishing analysis. You know, we were in our early 20s, so I think back about it and I think, gosh, it was quite amazing, because you could go anywhere in South Africa and take 20, 22-year-olds off and you would find a really compelling and interesting analysis. So I think the strength of IDASA was not so much its plans, but its ability to, in a complex environment, search for answers and find answers in terms of what to do. So to answer your question about the black and white, from the underground perspective, the strategy of the ANC were built around the 4 pillars. I think everybody's familiar with the 4 pillars. But now, operationally speaking, if you had a monolith here that believed solidly in apartheid, and on the other side you had the anti-apartheid grouping, the question was, what do you do with this solid group? Do you reinforce it so that they are more united, or do you open it up and like this? Now, once you've opened it up, and ambiguity is really how you open it up, there are cracks. And then us activists, we had to work in those cracks, and I'll show you the programs and tell you about the programs, how we worked in those cracks. But in that sense, Van was very important, because his moral authority, his integrity, and his intellectual astuteness gave us the credibility that that we required, because we were nobodies. You know, we were known a little bit, but you know, he was somebody, we were not really anybody. And we used that, and he knew that we were using it, and you know, we talked a lot about it. So the programs that we then did to do it, in terms of your question about racial reconciliation, we had said in the Afrikaans community, and that were and there's a discussion between me and Van and other Afrikaners in IDASA, which later led to Gore Institute and Dakar and Gore Institute and so on. And that question was, what does it mean to be an Afrikaner without apartheid? And you'll see when we get to Gore Institute, that's why Van wrote the book Afrikaner, Afrikaan. That captured a sort of long-term conversation, ongoing conversation that started in IDASA, because they said, but we can't as Afrikaners accept that this is us, oppressors, racists, exploiters. It can't be. And there are intellectual traditions in Afrikanerdom that go back to Adam Tas and other people that always resisted this kind of thing. You know, where Brayton was also part of that kind of thing. So how do we recover that alternative narrative and build on it, and then link it to the broader society in South Africa, so that it doesn't become some kind of chauvinistic or, you know, process. So the programs we then ran in close coordination with the ANC were programs really to look at Afrikanerdom and say, what keeps this monolith together? And what kept this monolith together were in many ways a set of justifiers of apartheid. And those justifiers provided the justification of it, which gave people the will to resist it. Now, how do you break down that will? So we looked at the religious community, because Afrikanerdom justified apartheid through their religious interpretation of the Bible. We looked at intellectuals. There were a number of Afrikaner intellectuals who justified it intellectually. We looked at students, and that time, since I was a student age, that was my principal focus. We looked at conscripts, and we looked at the business community. And we said, if you can bring these people away from apartheid, the emperor will be left naked. And that operationally was how you took the broad strategies of the ANC in exile then, and you operationalized it inside South Africa. So we said, let's open up Afrikanerdom. Now, open up Afrikanerdom meant you didn't have to convince them to join the ANC. You had to make them ambiguous about their beliefs. Now, if you can take the justifiers away, then you can reason. Until then, you are fighting with beliefs. Now, everybody knows, if somebody believes something, it's like talking to a deaf person. Yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. You can't get to a dialogue, and you can't get to the kind of political dialogue that we thought we needed. So we ran, and we had to very carefully calibrate, and this was Janet, myself, Nick, and others, calibrate that project. And Van, which I discussed it with him openly. I mean, the good thing about Van was from the start, it was an open conversation. Look, we are in touch with the ANC. Do you understand that? Are you okay with it? We know it's blah, blah, blah. Alex also knew. Alex knew, his own son was in the liberation movement. So, that was another channel. So, those things, you had to coordinate those kind of underground things, which later became the exposure of the death squatch of the regime, if I talk for myself, in my case. And then the civic part, and then the political part. So again, that thing ran through, because once you started to deal with people in the civil service, and there were few, Fani Olivier, not Fani Olivier, what was his name? Fani Kluter, and others who were in constitutional defense. Once we managed to talk to them, things started to open up there, because now you could get the ideas in. So what many people thought in those days were, there was IDASA trying to be a secretive organization, trying to protect itself. Of course, we were scared of penetration, the famous story of Mark Baer and so on, by the security police. But in fact, it was not really such a big worry, because you wanted the regime to hear the message from the ANC. So we said, yeah, let them hear it. And they said, but aren't you scared? This one looks a bit dodgy and so on. I said, no, bring the dodgy ones, bring them. Let them hear for themselves, because they will take the message back right into the security establishment, and that's what we want. So I think to come to your question about black and white and reconciliation, the project was far more political, because the context required far more political things. So we were scared as activists that it would be an airy-fairy kind of wishy-washy white liberal kind of, let's all drink tea together kind of thing. And it was never that, and deliberately it was never that. And it was inbuilt in the structure in IDASA, because IDASA started off with a white director and a black director. Eric Mutonga and, a white counterpart. That's how it started off, 2 directors, 1 white, 1 black. So I don't think, the dialogue was dialogue for political purposes, strategically. So now I'm not talking operationally or tactically. What we were building strategically was a middle ground. And what was that middle ground? The middle ground was that apartheid must go. And the middle ground was basically two things. Once apartheid is gone, we need a non-racial unitary South Africa that is democratic, so three things. That was the consensus. And we said, let's build the consensus around those three things. A democratic South Africa, and democracy meaning you restore the sovereignty of the people. That's why, from the start, the idea that the people must govern was a central aim and claim of the struggle. And then the mechanisms of how you do it, you know, democracy and so on, became really important, became the nitty-gritty. Unitary state and non-racial unitary state and a democratic state. Well, that's a very important question, and it is entirely relevant to the discussion, because the South Africa in our days, in the 1970s and 80s, was a divided country. And it was the apartheid era. That changed in 1996. We no longer live under apartheid. Now, the important point here is that what made it possible for us to achieve what many people said was impossible to achieve was because everybody in South Africa over time, through all these processes, you know, IDASA was really an important actor, but not the only one. There was the Five Freedoms Forum and many others. Apart from the UDF, you know, the UDF was really the umbrella domestically under which everybody operated, including ourselves. South Africa then needed to be brought together, and this consensus, which was later embodied in the constitutional process, was actually the national consensus, that this is who we want to be, this is who we were in the past, and this is the past we want to undo. We don't want this. That's why people have to understand the Constitution is a transformational Constitution. It is not a reactionary Constitution. It says we must, bearing in mind what the past was, transform it. The racial past, the violent past, the divided past, the colonial past, the oppressive past, the racist past, all of those things have to go. The important point here is that now, or to build on the transformative idea of the Constitution, it tells us you have to be transformative. The danger is that building a middle ground now about something that was relevant in the past, i.e. the modernization of our polity, also has certain dangers, because transformation, the enemy of transformation is inertia. And we need a society that does not suffer from inertia, but a society that is creatively busy transforming a very horrible past. And this idea in South Africa that somebody will give it to you either through, you know, just radical redistribution. Of course, redistribution has to happen, but in itself, it's a means to an end. You know, it's one step in a creative process. That's what the Constitution really says. So I would just say that if there is to be a middle ground, it's not a middle ground about, look, there was the romantic past when we all sat around the table and discussed and had all kinds of nice, airy-fairy feelings, holding each other's hands. Oh, very important as those things were. I mean, I'm not minimizing them. And they were major achievements then. But our intelligence in the past was our ability to read the context realistically and properly, and figuring out what has to be done in this context, not in our heads. You know, the madness of South Africa is people living in their heads. That's the historical madness of South Africa. So, the British come here and Rhodes says, I'm going to turn you all into English people. It's an idea in his head. It's a crazy idea because you don't have Englishmen in front of you. The Boer come in, the Afrikaners, and they say, well, I'm going to take the blacks away. Well, it's a crazy idea. You can't take the blacks away. Where do you come from? Now you get all kinds of races who say whites are like this and blacks are like this. It's a crazy idea in your head. There's a real person in front of you. Why don't you rather encounter that thing? So we're back in that way where we were with IDASA. I say, stop thinking about blacks as this. Blacks are not like this. Why don't you meet them? That was the origin of those historical township tours. You said, just let them meet each other for real. Touch your hand and say, my name is Sipho and my name is Miriam and blah, blah, blah. So that intelligence of reading the environment and responding to it is very important. Now, we can't now drag our society back to the romantic past of the 1996 and the 1980s and the 1970s, where talking to each other was a breakthrough. We've achieved democracy. That's not our problem now. Our consensus is, whilst the polity has been modernized, the economic structure of South Africa is the same basic economic structure that came from colonialism. What people forget when we think about the history of South Africa is in 2003 the Americans invaded Iraq. Why? Because they needed oil. In South Africa, in 1899, the British invaded South Africa. There was no such a country as South Africa then. They invaded this place. Why? Because of gold. Why was gold important? Gold was the gold standard in terms of global finance, and Britain as an empire had financial troubles. So they wanted to resolve their financial troubles by, just as the Americans did in 2003, creating a pretext, a false pretext. The British created a false pretext here and invaded this place. 1911 is the Mining Act. Now they found South Africa, 1909. It's an act in the British Parliament, the historic exclusion of blacks as a compromise to some Afrikaners who were dispossessed during that war, like many blacks were already dispossessed before. Now, 1911 is the Mining Act. They take the mines. 1913, I need cheap labor. There's a thriving peasant community in the Eastern Cape and all over South Africa. This peasantry is decimated. Why? The miners need cheap labor to take the mines, to take the gold out. And that's the history of our country, the exploitation of cheap black labor. And you can go from Marikana, you can go from that history straight to Marikana. It's the same people and the same system. Now, how do you have a political system of colonial apartheid, which is dismantled in 1996 and replaced with a proper democracy where the people's sovereignty to some extent is restored? But next to it, in terms of the political economic structure of South Africa, you have an economic structure that is completely out of kilter with this. It cannot work. It cannot work. One of these things will have to give. Either we're going to become more authoritarian or we're going to democratize the economy. The problem we have at the moment, to come back to your question about the middle ground and the consensus, is what we have to build consensus around is not about the past. In other words, let's take the old economy and share it. That economy is not fit for the modern world. It is not. It is based on exploitation. If you put a white person or a black person on top of a mine that runs on the basis of the exploitation of labor, you're going to be an exploiter. In a global world, globalization, you've got to compete with Australia. They've mechanized. So our middle ground has to be constructed, if we talk about the future, around another imperative in the Constitution. And people should go and read the Constitution, because the Constitution says the state will be developmental. It says so, the Constitution, not me, the Constitution. And the reason why it says this is because the state must be, the constitution is transformative. The state must be an instrument to transform our society and our political economy and our society, the norms and values of our society. So, that structure and that consensus is what we have to build, that this current structure of our economy cannot last. If we try and engineer economic growth with this structure, we may achieve 5% if we're lucky, but it will be done at the expense of the political. It's not sustainable in the long term. And just redistribution is not the only solution, although you have to do it. We have to create, it's a creative process, entirely new enterprises that can compete globally and that uses the strengths of our society to compete. Now, if we want to build a middle ground around that, I'm all for it. So not Institute for a Democratic Alternative of South Africa, but Institute for a Developmental Alternative of South Africa. And that would be the basis, because as I said to you in the beginning, the focus of IDASA was politically correct for the times we were in. So I don't want to build consensus now, just dialogue for the sake of dialogue. And that would be my fear about many people, your point about Ramatlhodi. I don't think that's what he was saying, but I'm just saying. My fear would be there's too much of this kind of Tea Party approach, that we all sit and tell each other how unhappy we are and South Africa is in such a mess and this one is not right and that leader is not right. We're all not right. Let's start there. We are all not right. We've lost the way. The only way to get the way back is to read the environment for what it is, not for what's in our heads like mad people. Well, I'm saying that you can't heal the wind through talking. We've had that in the Reconciliation Commission, which was very necessary, and dialogue is a good thing, let me just say. I mean, I'm not against dialogue. I'm just saying people will get tired of dialogue, because how many times can you say this or that? The advantage of IDASA was that it was connected, as I said, to these three levels, to a political problem, not just a civic project. And that political project meant you built real things and you moved processes forward. Now, the same here. The dialogue around development must be, and I say development because remember, it's we can talk for hours about it, because it is also related to the idea of the two types of economies that we have, the first economy and the second economy. The first economy being developed, but colonially developed, and the second economy being poor and underdeveloped. And that's why the focus must be on development. And I want to link this to the broader African agenda, because that's one thing that people also forget, is that remember IDASA from the start was not only a creation of Van and Alex, it was also a creation with the consent of the ANC and the involvement of real ANC people in it, but also the rest of the continent. It was never, like our liberation, was never a South African affair only. It was always, right from the start, the Harare Declaration, the AU, or the Organization of African Unity, they were all involved in taking these processes forward. Kaunda was central to these things. You know, I recall just very quickly, and as one of those IDASA things, or long before IDASA things, him standing next to him with a very wonderful Afrikaner whose role in getting us where we were not recognized enough. Javier van der Merwe was a Quaker here at GCT. Standing with Javier and I think Ampie Miller and myself, no, it was not Ampie, I think it was Ampie's brother, I don't know. Well, anyway, Javier was definitely there. But standing there with KK and, you know, standing there and he's serving us scones, and, you know, I'm a young student and I'm very embarrassed that the head of state would serve me. He says, no, 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 you sit there. I'm like in early 20s, you know, so here's this wise old African head of state, you know, an icon. And he said to us then, he said, you know, South Africa is a volcano. And we used to laugh at him because he used to make that speech a lot. He said, South Africa is a volcano. When it hits, when it erupts, it will erupt, it will engulf the whole region. So the whole region, not only the frontline states, but beyond the frontline states, were involved in the whole process, in helping the ANC think it through, etc. So that Pan-African involvement was very important. Now, to link it to my point about the middle ground, the African Union has also a developmental focus. So to align ourselves with a continental agenda and with a reality that is ours, which is underdevelopment and a lack of economic growth. This is surely for me quite obvious that that's what we should be doing. We should all be talking about the creative processes of a new kind of economy that doesn't look like the colonial economy. Remember, the Institute was a result of the Dakar meeting. And at the end of the Dakar meeting, President Abdou Diouf, who was then the president of Senegal and the host of the Dakar meeting, had asked, now after this, what happens? Is this it? Because remember, Dakar had trips to Burkina Faso, you know, Ghana and Senegal. So it was not just visiting one place. And that was the question, what else? And he actually suggested, and that's why I say, you know, this is the official history of the Institute. It was our brochure of the time. And he suggested that something must, on a continental scale, must happen after South Africa's liberation, basically. So again, I'm back at the point that, you know, the continent was deeply involved in guiding our struggle in many ways, and also in taking it forward. So for us, I think you used the word, Breyten said it was berekende Afrikanisme, beredeneerde Afrikanisme. Yeah. So, and that's why I say that's at that meeting that you've said, what happens after this? This surely can't be the end. And that conversation kept going. It started there, but it kept going. And as I said, you know, Van and I had a running conversation about what does it mean to be an Afrikaner without apartheid and without Afrikaner nationalism in Africa? And we said, well, it has to be something to do with that, but we first got to figure out what is our continent. Now, you can't know this in the abstract. That's the mad idea we all oppose. Let's meet it for itself in the real world and learn what it is, because we don't know. And that was the ongoing conversation, and Diouf was central to that initiative, and so was the ANC. So just to tell you, is Diouf then sent 2 envoys. Now, in those days, you couldn't get, South Africans couldn't go to those places. So we could go because we got special permission and the ANC helped us. You couldn't move without it. Diouf sent 2 envoys here to figure out, once things started to move in South Africa, what should we do? Should we take it forward? And Van said to me, well, you're responsible for this program, you deal with it. So the two Iron Boys came, Van arranged for them to come because they were not allowed in, they were Senegalese, sent here by President Diouf, and I took them to the ANC, I took them to Mandela. And we had a meeting with Nelson Mandela in which this whole project, the Gore Institute and so on, was discussed as a follow-up to the meeting in Dakar. It was discussed with many ANC people, Mbeki, with Penuel Maduna, you know, I've got the list somewhere in the archive, all the people we took this delegation, 2 people to see and to consult, and they went back and they said, well, the ANC is all for it. Mandela said, yeah, he was very enthusiastic. He said, yeah, definitely. We should engage with our continent because we are part of it and we don't know it. So again, right from the start, it's not a unilateral South African experience. It is an experience that intimately involved the rest of the continent at all different levels. The principal significance was the Dakar meeting essentially took place there, and Diouf suggested do something. And that conversation, as I say, kept going after the Dakar meeting. And when things started to open up in South Africa, that was the opportune moment. Now, if you ask, all right, so, well, what is the significance of it? Then at the personal level, as I said, there was this ongoing discussion. If Afrikaners are going to fit into the new South Africa, the South Africa without apartheid, we'd better start talking to Afrikaners about what it means to be an Afrikaner without it, because they're going to be in trouble. We are going to be in trouble. So that's what we were trying to figure out, and why he wrote the book Afrikaner, Afrikaner. Because that was the culmination of that conversation, or, well, that was a part of a stepping stone in that conversation. But at the same time, you had to ask yourself, South Africa after apartheid, how does it relate to the rest of the continent? And the initial thoughts around, and as I said, Diouf was instrumental to that, because Diouf hosted the dialogue. And he said, let's continue the dialogue, but at a grander scale, on a continental scale. And the question then was, what is the problem with the continent? Now, that's a big question, of course. I'm not going to try and answer it, and we didn't try. But our answer, in terms of what can we contribute to solving the problem in question, was the idea of self-reliance. And that is basically that what happened in South Africa was not the result of foreign intervention. It was the result of a homegrown solution, of people realistically looking at their context, reading the context properly, responding intelligently, and then dealing with real problems in the real world, not imaginary problems in their head, the things they like, they don't like, their beliefs or whatever. And we said the same thing. In our continent, the first thing that needed to happen, in our view, was we must make a contribution for the continent to recover itself, like the sovereignty of the people in South Africa was in the process of being restored. That process is essential. If you want democracy to work, development to work, the premise of it is people must be the masters of their own destiny. And that philosophy of build your own theories, do your own research about our world, find your own solutions about our world. That was the spirit. Now you can read through all of this. I mean, I leave you this thing for you. You'll see there, this was formulated then. That was long before people started talking about the African Renaissance and all of those things, but certainly a very important thing for us was, how does that process happen? How does a continent with such an incredibly rich history recover itself? Now, when I first arrived in Dakar with Tanya, with Van's daughter, we stayed in the flat. We had nothing, you know, we had no money, nothing. We stayed in the flat of Senghor. Leopold Sedar Senghor. So they were all very interested, all those intellectuals. You'll see Semben Usman was on our board, you know, Sheikh Hamidou Khan, all these people were, Yusan Dur was then young, we were very close friends, and used to run around and roam the streets of Dakar at night. And that was an intellectual milieu, in part fed by Senghor's ideas of negritude and all of those things, and a sort of more recent trend then around democratization and dialogue, and then of course the reality of the decolonization, political decolonization of the continent, which is why the Organization of African Unity became the African Union, shifting from political liberation to economic liberation, which is why I say for us, the key debate now is really a developmental debate. How do we take this country and develop it so that it materially provides in an inclusive way for everybody? So those threads of a tapestry were all there, but it was a Pan-African thread. It was never just a South African thread, neither in IDASA nor in the Institute. The Institute still exists. You know, each director has to bring his or her own stamp on it. This was mine and Van and Brayton's stamp. Currently, they are much more focused on fighting for democracy, fighting for human rights, etc., especially electoral systems and so on. And you'll see that whenever there was a visit from an important leader, you know, recently Obama, their first stop is Gore, and as part of that stop, it's the Gore Institute. And so, I mean, in that sense, the story is not over. It's a process. When I went, you know, as I said, there was nothing. We started really from scratch. I had peers across the continent because we were always a kind of a network, who also started similar institutes in other parts, in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, Ethiopia, a few other places, Eritrea, Ghana. And what gives me immense pride is of all those initiatives, we still exist. They don't. And that story, I think, is because there was a real Pan-Africanism, a real ethic around self-reliance, but there was a real Pan-Africanism that was built into the whole project right from its inception. And that's, you know, stood it in great strength. Well, what I basically wanted to say, sorry, thank you, is I think the sort of spirit of the Institute, I was very fortunate in all my work there. You know, I got to learn a lot about the continent. And I met up with the Cabral family, the Amical Cabral's family, and one of the quotes I read that I think has always inspired us and became the sort of capturing the essence really of the mission of the Institute at that time is this quote. That's what I wanted to read you. While we scrap colonial culture and the negative aspects of our own culture, whether in our environment, the context, or in our character, maybe culture, we have to create a new culture, also based on our traditions, but respecting everything that the world of today has conquered for the service of mankind meaning humankind. And he said this at a Cabral, Amical Cabral said this at a conference. You know, I had access to some of the archives there. He said this at a conference of the party. And I think that's, even today, remains for me a leitmotif and a quote that really captures a wisdom that you cannot cut yourself off from the world, that you've got to combine what the world has offered with your own environment, your own real world, and your own history. But then you have to make something new. Now that making it is, I think, is missing in South Africa in the discourse. There's too much, if you take from that one and give to that one, you're going to have more equality. No, we're not going to have more equality. We have to make more equality. And making more equality is a creative process, and it's better for us to do it together than to try and do it apart. So to give you an example of history, you know, I will refer you to, what was his name now, this fellow, he came to Dakar. He was a young mathematician from Harvard. I'll get you his name in a minute. And he flew over Africa, and he saw that villages looked as though they were constructed on a fractal logic. Now, fractals were only discovered in 1987 by Benoit Mandelbrot and so on. And he got very intrigued by this. And he came to Dakar to study this. And what he discovered, and written academic papers about it, and I mentioned specifically a Harvard mathematician because if you quote an African, people don't believe you. They say it's not real. I quote this guy because he had flown over the continent and had encountered villages that built according to fractals, and he thought this is impossible. Fractals only came into really, were conceived in 1987. Now, to make a long story short, he went in Dakar and then later to Mali, and he discovered the algorithms for these fractals, which are not only embedded in African games like Uri and all of these games, very popular games, strategy games in West Africa, but also in divination systems. And initially he thought it was intuitive. But the diviners in Mali said, we'll teach you. If you become a diviner, we can teach you. And he became a diviner. And he was totally astonished because they worked with abstract algorithms, fractal algorithms. Why I mention this is for, let's say, 100 years, during 200 years, colonialism, slavery, 400 years, people from outside walked across this continent and looked at things as though they were primitive. And because of that madness in their heads, the belief that you're dealing with primitive people, they could never see the real world. It took a young mathematician to be curious and to be open-minded, to discover the most amazing history of maths, one amongst many, because when he later went and plotted the way people make fences, he discovered that they make nonlinear fences. And again, they make nonlinear fences because of the dust that they have to keep out. And again, it was not intuitive. It worked according to conscious knowledge, knowledge that was passed on from generation to generation. So if you think in modern robotics, the idea of stigmergy. Stigmergy is basically a way in which people modify their environments and deposit knowledge in the environment, and is very popular amongst large-scale animal ant colonies and so on, how they learn. This is what they did. They deposited that knowledge in fences, in footpaths, in all kinds of natural ways in which knowledge was used to modify the environment and vice versa, so this interactive relationship. So the point that I want to make is there is a fascinating history in this continent that we felt, why are we not building on this? You know, this guy said, Why isn't this taught in engineering faculties? Now, I'm using this example as one of many examples that one can raise to say that that self-belief and that looking with an open mind at yourself and your own past and your own continent is really absolutely necessary. And when you talk to South Africans, even today, and you talk about the rest of the continent, they seem to still have these crazy ideas about what the rest of the continent is or is supposed to be. And if we can engage when we talk about building the center and the developmental center, not only engage with ourselves, but the rest of the continent in the spirit of Cabral and all our other liberation movements of self-reliance with an open mind, open society, self-reliant, then I think I would say, yes, one can do dialogue. The dialogue is related to action, and that's the political purpose. If we were just having people talking to each other, South Africa would still be politically in apartheid. There were consequences of the talking that meant people were killed because they acted on what they learned or what they believed. The same now. This is the Tea Party style that I don't like. We sit, we talk, and then we go home. Now, you can't also say to people, the country has to change. And people say, yes, yes, I understand. But what must I do? Now, ask any decent person, white or black. Yes, what must I do? Tell me. They don't say, what must I talk about? They say, what must I do? Now, the political leadership and the intellectual leadership, you know, somebody like Van, Mbeki, Mandela, Tambo, most incredible ANC leader, which is completely underestimated in the history of this country. What an unbelievable intellect and a real human being. I mean, if I think of Van, I think intellect, moral authority, human being, humor. You laughed the whole time with Van. As you engaged in the most serious of discussions, he read so widely, he read so much, but he could care just in ordinary human menselijkheid. He could care about nobody. You know, you drive with Van, and there's a black guy in those days standing next to the road, a down and outer, young guy standing there, he's hiking. White people didn't pick anybody up, let alone black people. Van would stop. You say, what are you doing? No, I'm picking up this guy. Oh, all right. The guy gets in. Now he starts. What's your name? Where do you come from? Long story short, before long, that guy is working there, driving his car, going to school, something happens. That was Van. He wouldn't miss an ordinary person. And that's why, in a way, that philosophy of being both intellectually able to work with abstract ideas, but being thoroughly rooted in the world of people around you, real people, that was Van. And that's what we need, is real people doing real things with real other people, not